So, welcome to a long form video. My name's Damien, Cheshire Cat Musings. I'm sure you're all aware of that. I'm joined by a colleague and friend, Alistair McConaughey, from a YouTube channel, A Force for Good. The first thing I want to do is give Alistair the floor and let him introduce himself and tell you a little bit about what they do and why it's important. And then we'll get into the meat of the conversation we're going to have today.
Thanks very much, Damien. It's a pleasure to be on your show. I love Cheshire Cat Musings. You've been on our show as well at A Force for Good.
Yeah.
A Force for Good was established in March 2012, about a couple of years before the actual referendum on, as I call it, UK membership, although the Scottish separatist called it the independence referendum. I called it the UK membership referendum, which is essentially what it was. We were established to campaign for Scotland's place in the United Kingdom, to emphasise that the United Kingdom is Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales, and without Scotland we wouldn't even have a United Kingdom anymore. You'd simply have England, Wales and Northern Ireland, probably increasingly fractious against each other as well. So it was a very important referendum which we won in 2014, and since then we have kept going. It's my full-time occupation, and we now consider ourselves the premier pro-UK campaigning group and think tank in Scotland, if not in fact the United Kingdom when you think about it, because I can't think of many other non-party political campaigning groups whose sole purpose is keeping the British end up, as we like to say. So around that slogan, A Force for Good, we've built a team of several people who create content daily across all the social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, TikTok, Substack. I don't think I've left any out, as well as our own website, aforceforgood.uk. And the content is basically educational and political. And when we're not creating content, we're having street stalls on a regular basis in the centre of Glasgow. And when we're not doing that, we may be organising events, often in George Square. So we've done a lot. We just celebrated our 13th birthday last month, and we've absolutely no intention of stopping, because this is something that is essentially an eternal battle, really. It's not just for the run-up to a referendum. It's a lifestyle, as it were. You know, being British is not just for a day, it's for a lifetime. I just made that up there, but it sounds quite good, actually. It's like a pet. It's not just for Christmas, it's for a lifetime. Being British is not just for a referendum, it's for a lifetime. And we love what we do, and we love the United Kingdom. And as we always like to say, we love the UK. We're British and we want to stay together. And we try to keep that positive, upbeat message at all times, and to emphasize the greatness, actually, of our United Kingdom and how great it is to be British. And at the same time, of course, we separate that from our politicians, who very often let us down in Westminster. And many people, especially some of the Scottish nationalist sorts, they'll look at the Tory government or the Labour government and they'll mistakenly think that's Britain, when it's not. That's just politicians, often poor politicians. They're not representing Britain. Britain is something that we create ourselves every day in our own lives, and it's mirrored through our own particular care for and commitment to and loyalty to our fellow men and women in the United Kingdom, and as well as the history and heritage of the United Kingdom. and the institutions and the rituals and so on that come together to make a sense of Britishness. So we're trying to
Yeah.
constantly push those facts, and it's good. It's good fun. I enjoy it. I'm very lucky to have this job. I'm very enthusiastic about it, and I love the fact that Cheshire Cat Musings has also seen those sorts of things as well. Because I remember you came up to Scotland. That's when we first met, which would be in 2014, and you have the exact same view of the nation of Britain, which I use as shorthand for Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. You have the same idea of that nation as we do, and I think that's fantastic.
I think it's a rather sad state of affairs that our unionism needs to be advertised. We need to go out with our sandwich boards and our bells and ring it from the rooftops, and we need to proclaim that we're British, for lack of a better phrase. I think it's a sad state of affairs that the politicians have allowed it to happen. And as far as I can understand, they've done it for identity politics. They don't want a united British people to challenge their authority. They want to carve off Wales, they want to carve off Scotland, and they want to carve off Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK, meaning England. And they do it solely for political gain. They do it solely so the uni party of Labour and Tories stay in Westminster in perpetuity. And I think that's where the fight will always be. From my point of view, that's why the reform movements, even though it's got major problems currently, we all know what's happening with Rupert Lowe and whatnot. I'm sure that will sort itself out in due course. That's why that sort of thing is necessary. And it really shouldn't be like that. When I hear people in Scotland from the separatist side turn around and say to me, well, butt out, it's nothing to do with you, you're English. I'm like, well, no, the entire country is mine, thank you very much. I'll decide what I want to talk about and when I want to talk
Exactly.
about it. That's my point of view on the matter. I care very much about people in Edinburgh. I care very much about people next door to me. I don't see any difference. And I'll be damned if I let anybody tell me that there is a difference, because there really isn't.
Absolutely. And the Scottish SNP type people who might say that, they don't understand the relationship in the way that people like you and I do. They only see themselves and the Scottish. They don't see the British. And as you say, if you're British, you're involved. It's your country that's being called into question here. It's literally your country and your identity, whether you're English, Scottish, Northern Irish, or Welsh. If you believe in the United Kingdom, then if somebody in some part of that United Kingdom is trying to break up the United Kingdom, then clearly that's an issue for you. It doesn't matter if you live there or if you identify with that particular part of the United Kingdom or not. It's your issue. You need to be involved. And I think the SNP were quite clever in making some people in England think, oh, that's just for them up there. I shouldn't get involved. What's it got to do with me? Well, if they really thought that, then what that tells me is that their commitment to Britain and their commitment to being British wasn't really particularly strong in the first place. If they didn't feel a visceral concern about that, about the potential of the United Kingdom breaking up, if they didn't really care about that at any kind of level, then they what was their identity? What is their identity? You could say, "Oh, I'm absolutely English, fine," but if you don't, if you feel British, then you definitely should be concerned about something. Doesn't matter where it's happening. We feel the pain of a tragedy that happens in England here in Scotland, and vice versa. Um, um, a political issue also is relevant whether it happens in Scotland or anywhere else. It's relevant to anybody who cares about the United Kingdom at the end of the day. So, yeah, and you mentioned the politicians there as well. I formed the opinion that a lot of the politicians don't didn't and still don't and didn't back at the referendum period didn't really have themselves much of an idea of British nationhood, as it were. I mean, if you had asked David Cameron, who was the person that came up with the idea of the referendum, if you had asked him what Britishness was, I don't know if he could really have told you. Really, I don't think he had a strong sense of what it is to be a Briton. Famously, he didn't know what Magna Carta was when he was when he was interviewed around about that time by an American presenter, or he didn't know what it meant. The words Magna Carta. I mean, even if you had never heard of it before, you could probably make a stab at it. But the I can't remember if it was prime minister at the time or if he was going to be prime minister. But at that point, I thought, oh my goodness, we're in trouble. So on one side, the Unionists had him, and on the other side, the Scottish nationalists had these committed ideologues like Alex Salmond, who's since he was a teenager, he's been writing the books about Robert the Bruce, and his head's been in this space that's Scotland, and he's got all his stuff, and he's determined. And on our side, we've got this kind of posh guy from Oxford or wherever that doesn't know what the Magna Carta is. So we were lucky to win it. Thankfully, we did win it by almost 11 points. It was 10 point something, 10.6%, I think we won it by. But it shouldn't have been as close as that. But to be frank, one of the reasons it was so close was because many of us hadn't ever had to think about that. You know, it's like your Alex Salmonds of this world have been preparing for this for their life. They've got all their arguments ready to go. They've got this team of ideologues behind them. Whereas people like us were like, oh, crikey, we've got to make a case now for Britishness. We've got to actually stand up there and say, why is the union a good thing? Okay. And so we had to start doing the work that we have since, that we began back then and are still continuing to this day. So it forced us to become ideologues for the United Kingdom, which hitherto we had not needed to do because the country had just rumbled along. From one crisis to another, basically.
The first inclination that I ever got that there was something a bit off in Britain between the home nations was in Euro 96. It was the first time I think, from what I can recall, that England and Scotland played each other in an international football game at home. And it was just remarkable because it was like part of the country playing another part of the country, and I never really understood what all that was about. But then when you look into the history of game football, it's all about grandfather rights because the first international was between Scotland and England way back in the day. But if you look at the England winning the World Cup in the 1966 World Cup final, if you look at the stadium in Wembley, you didn't really see the flag of St. George. You're seeing the Union Jack, and that was for England. And it wasn't for Britain, it was for England. And that always, I wouldn't say concerned me, but it raised an eyebrow. I was like, how have we gone from in 1966, the Union Jack or the Union flag being flown at the England World Cup final, to the flag of St. George in 1996 against the Scottish Saltire? Now, obviously, I've looked into the fact that apparently, again, I don't know this from personal experience, the flag of St. George was appropriated by the National Front, or what the media would deem far-right groups. Now, I don't know how true that is. I don't know if it is actually true. However, I've spoken to other Scots, other people in Scotland, and they said they've always had the feeling that English people have like a sense of shame or a sense of identity crisis. That they're much more happy identifying, if you're in England, identifying yourself as British and riding the Union Jack banner rather than the flag of St. George. What's your view on that? What's your opinion on that?
That's a good point. I haven't really hitherto thought of that, or the idea that some people might be ashamed of that. I've never really heard that before. I think that for many years, before Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism came on the scene, I think many people were just happy to use the Union Jack. But by the time you're getting into the 1970s, things were just changing socially in the country. I don't know quite why, but there was, and it might have just been an upsurge in regional nationalism that pushed other flags such as the Union Jack just out of the picture. I know people used to say, "Oh, the National Front used to use the Union Jack," and so maybe your kind of mainstream people didn't want to fly it as a consequence of that. But that seems pretty retarded, really. I mean, I don't know how true that is. But certainly, I don't think there's any of those kind of associations with the Union Jack anymore, if there ever was. What you do have, though, of course, is much more use of the flags of the home nations, as it were. Very
Yeah.
much, which you alluded to, there's a consequence of sports, particularly football and rugby. I don't see anything wrong with that as such, unless it's used deliberately for separatist purposes. Then I don't like that. But just we've nothing against flying the Saltire or flying
I always
the
seen it
Cross of St
as
George or anything like that. I think that's largely healthy, so long as you don't, as I say, weaponize it against your fellow Britons. That wouldn't be very good in our view.
well, that's what I seen with the SNP. What they actually did is they actually politicised what I would always see as banter between the
Mhm,
Scots and the
mhm,
English,
mhm,
and this
mhm.
also politicised it. Like, say, for example, down in, I'm just south of Liverpool, and they had a Merseyside derby tonight. It was Everton versus Liverpool, and yes, Liverpool won. That's great. We're going to win the league. However, that's why I always view the banter between Scotland and England as it was like a rivalry between neighbouring football clubs, and it was all harmless. It was all in good fun. We're all British at the end of the day. But what the SNP did is they politicised that very harmless banter and made it something really, really, from a unionist point of view, scary. I'm going to use that phrase. It's scary. You've got this group of people. Not only do they not like being in the UK, but they've got a visceral hatred of Britain so strong that they want to break up the country over it. And from somebody from England who's never really seen it as an issue, I found it very, very scary.
Yeah, yes, there is undoubtedly an element of the Scottish so-called nationalists. I don't quite like using that phrase because, in a way, I'm a Scottish nationalist in the sense that I want the best for the Scottish nation. Um, Scottish separatists might be a more accurate term in the sense that they want to break away. There is a proportion of them that are very militant in that sense, but most people who vote for the SNP, they don't really harbor any animosity or whatever. They're just not thinking through the consequences of what they're doing. They're not thinking through the idea of a Scotland broken away from the rest of the UK, the social consequences that would result from that, and the obvious economic problems that would very likely result from that, and very often just the impracticality of that as well. I mean, how can you break away really in our very close knit social and cultural island? I mean, how can you? It's not really practical. So there's a lot of people who are just not really thinking through the consequences. The actual
With the
numbers who
source,
are
well, with
militantly
sort,
against the English, I don't think is particularly high, but they certainly do provide the motive force for that movement.
Well, I've always seen myself as a bit of a British Mongol because I've got people in my family. Basically, my great grandparents came over to the mainland from Southern Ireland
Oh yeah.
before the partition in the first decade of the 20th century. They actually helped build one of the Mersey tunnels.
Mm.
So I've got Irish roots on my mother's side. Obviously, a lot of the Irish did actually come over to the Liverpool area, which makes sense because my mum's from Liverpool. And then from my dad's side, his dad came from North Wales.
Right.
So I've always seen myself as British for that reason as well. Not only do I have a British passport, British driving license, what have you, but I'm the very example of a Mongol of Britain or Great Britain and all the British Isles, even. And
Absolutely.
because of that, I mean, if you look into it, if you try and go down that avenue of you're just Scottish, you're just Welsh, it's quite impossible because you've intermingled and you've intermarried to such a degree between the home nations that that's nonsensical in my view. If you're of the British Isles, you're of the British Isles. I'll even include Southern Ireland in that, even though they are a republic now, because it's just the native Britons are all five nations in the British Isles.
I totally concur. Absolutely. Absolutely. That's 100% it. And um, you there's so many people like yourself who have got English mothers, Scottish fathers, you name it, living in Wales, whatever. I mean, that is the great thing about the British identity, is that it's the perfect identity for our particular little group of islands. And if you want, it's also an identity where you can say you're Scottish and British, for
Hmm.
example, because there'll be times that you might want to talk up your Scottish identity. And and it's usually only again at sporting games. You know, that's sport, for better or for worse, has definitely been one of these forces in the culture which has often divided people. Um,
Or whether a Scotsman being Sean Connery was the best James Bond.
yes, well, the James Bond's father, or was it his mother, was meant to be Scottish anyway, and
But
married a
I'm a bit of
Scandinavian.
I'm a bit of an outlier because I don't think Connery is the best Bond. Sorry to say, and I don't think Daniel Craig or Roger Moore, being the two English Bonds, is the best James Bond either. I actually think it's Pierce Brosnan, the Irishman. So, and a lot of people say, well, James Bond has to be British. Well, no, no, I wouldn't say so because, as I say, Pierce Brosnan is from Southern Ireland and he was the best Bond in my view. And you've even got the Aussie George Lazenby. Yes, he's from the Commonwealth. He was okay. He wasn't great. He was no Sean Connery. But again, this is the thing. This is what I'm referring to when I'm referring to the banter between the home nations. This is the type of thing it always used to be. We'll set aside that Sean Connery is a Scot now. We can set that aside. We can set that aside that he got a knighthood from the Queen as part of the British state. Bit of a hypocrite. We can set all that aside. This is all banter. This is what I mean. It's all very nice and harmless, and this is the way it should be. Nice back and forth, and that's the way it should be in my view.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I don't think that's really been harmed too much. It it the the referendum did, however, it did sort of bring in differences, but I'd like to think we're kind of healing from that now, especially with the Scottish nationalists having kind of self imploded here in Scotland. Um, Thanks very much to Nicola Sturgeon and her hubris in thinking that she could bring in all sorts of crazy gender recognition laws for her own ideological purposes without taking the Scottish people with her. And all of that came to a head 2 years ago. 15th of February 2023, I think, was when she resigned. And so basically, she set the downward motion for the SNP. Hamza Yusuf came in, made a complete dog's breakfast of the party. He resigned last year, was it? And now they've got John Swinney, who is just Mr. Boring, who's just holding on with the life support system for the SNP, and everybody's eyes are on 2026, 7th of May 2026, when there will be the Holyrood election. And many people are hoping that the SNP are going to take a tumble. And it had been looking like they were going to suffer hard consequences at the hands of Scottish Labour, which is another party led by a man of immigrant descent, Anas Sarwar. However, as a consequence of Keir Starmer and his lack of support, you could say, it doesn't look like Scottish Labour are going to do particularly well either. And so everything's up for grabs next year, and everybody's wondering whether the SNP plus the Greens will be able to get sufficient numbers in order to form some sort of government in the 129 member parliament. There's 129 MSPs, but one of them becomes the person up front. What do they call them? The chair, the person, presiding officer. Yes. So there's like 128 in the actual circle. So you need to get like 64.
That's what you call the. That's what you call the Speaker in the Scottish Parliament, isn't it? Presiding officer. It's
presiding officer is we always have to be different in Scotland. That's the thing in Scotland. If the English do one thing, we've got to do something different. We've got to do the same thing, but give it a different name.
Do you think the Scottish Secretary at the time vetoing the balmy gender recognition laws that Nicola Sturgeon was trying to bring in, putting biological males into female prisons, and vetoing that and saying it goes against basically the devolution settlement, would you like to see a more assertive, sovereign British government pull rank on the Scottish Parliament more often? Because
Absolutely.
I think in the 30 years, I think in the history of devolution, it's only been done once. And you see it a lot more, say, in the United States with the federal government versus the state governments. Do you think that the British Parliament should be asserting its veto more often, in your view?
I do think that, and I think it should. I think it can be done perfectly constitutionally and for good reason. I mean, the idea was, and I know we can debate this until the cows come home, but Labour at the time, when they brought in devolution, they said that it would kill nationalism stone dead.
Yeah, and that was the theory. That was the
theory. Well, in a sense, you could try to contain nationalism, but to try to contain nationalism, you do need to assert yourself upon Holyrood when Holyrood is doing something that's only going to make the British Union relationship worse.
Well, let's call it what it is. Some of the policies that the SNP brought out were just completely insane. And I say that as a critical friend of Scotland and a partner in the Union. Some of the policies that your politicians put through in Scotland, to the rest of us and the rest of the UK, they're just completely insane. They're completely insane. And I'm sorry to cut you off there, Alistair. I just have to get off my chest. Some of your politicians are completely nuts.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, but they were really just left to do their own thing, because the fear was, whether it was the Labour in Westminster or whether it was the Tories in Westminster, is, oh, if we tread heavily here, then somehow this is going to backfire on us. And I was always of the opinion, no, it won't, because there's so many people in Scotland who don't support what the Holyrood executive might be doing. Okay, you might get a little bit of pushback from the people in the executive. You might get a little bit of pushback from MSPs. But remember, there's the majority of people out here in Scotland who didn't vote for whoever is the executive at Holyrood, who didn't vote for the SNP. The majority of Scots did not vote and have never voted for the executive that sits in Holyrood and that governs us. The majority of Scots have never voted. So we need Westminster to act as a brake upon Holyrood.
To pull rank as and when needed.
To pull rank. And that's a constitutional right that they've got. And it's proper that they've got that. If they want to hold the union together, if they want to make sure that Holyrood isn't allowed to do anything that's going to fracture the union and fray it and make it worse, then it's for the people at Westminster to say, no, that's not going to work. To think what's around the corner with that policy, no, you have to rein that one back in. But what happened was, it was just left to do its own thing. It was left to its own devices. We don't want to get involved was the approach. And the most amazing thing, when that guy, the Scottish Secretary of State at the time, intervened. Now, he intervened, it was just because of a technicality. It wasn't because of any moral point of view on his behalf that it was wrong from a moral or social standpoint what she was doing. It was a technicality that if this gender law is brought up in Scotland, because there's free travel from Scotland to England and vice versa, it's going to complicate matters in the NHS in England. And it was a technical thing like that. So he says, no, this isn't going to work. And he came in and he said no. And everybody in Scotland who didn't like Nicola Sturgeon cheered. 3 cheers, 3 cheers for the Scottish Secretary of State. It's wonderful. And that was the beginning of our downfall. And that's interesting, because as soon as somebody said, hello, you're not doing that, it was like you pulled the curtain back from behind the Wizard of Oz and you just saw what was there, which was a person that didn't have the power to take her position forward. So yeah, you have to do a lot more of that, but that requires
political courage and political will.
Political courage and will and stamina and all that kind of stuff. And too often these guys, whoever's Secretary of State for Scotland or whatever, they just can't be bothered. No, just
so what I want to move slightly onto, I want to move the conversation slightly onto, I put a video out yesterday, and the video was about the nature of the monarchy. Now, the way that our monarchy and our constitutional settlement currently works is sovereignty is the king and parliament. That is the king, currently Charles III, acting on the advice of his ministers in Parliament in Westminster. So the House of Commons and the House of Lords and the Crown constitute sovereignty in Britain and Northern Ireland. And I've seen a few YouTubers and a few other people, now they may not be politically knowledgeable or they may not be politically savvy, but they think that in Britain we don't have the executive orders that President Trump has in America. We do have them, but they're called something else in Britain. They're called orders in council. Now, basically, that's when government goes to the Crown, i.e. the King, to put their business through. And basically, it all gets approved formally. So when people say, we can't turn the small boats back to France, we cannot stop the invasion of the borders, well, we can, because that's the way our system works, meaning the king acts on the advice of his government ministers, and the orders in council and batches of orders in council is basically what we use to get anything done. I was watching a video from the early 1990s, before devolution, and basically it was appointing school inspectors in Scotland, and they're done this way, where they go to the monarch and say we need to do A, B, C, D, and E, and they get it done that way. And just by the monarch saying approved or saying, this is it, that's how it works. So when people say, well, we can't actually enforce the southern border, we cannot stop this invasion of all of these undocumented fighting age men, we can do it because the Parliament is sovereign. The only thing that's stopping that is the political will. There's no courage from the politicians to actually act to protect its own citizens. People use the ECHR as a fig leaf. They say we can't do it because of the ECHR, and they say you can't do it because of the 1951 Refugee Convention with the UN either. You can actually pass a piece of legislation through the Parliament to say, right, we're just going to disapply it. You don't have to leave the ECHR. You can just do an act of Parliament to say, well, we're going to disapply it. It doesn't apply in this case. And the same with the Refugee Convention. It's outdated. You don't have to leave the Refugee Convention. You can specifically say it does not apply. That's just my view on it. I'm very, very specific on it. I think that the answers are there, but you've got a lot of politicians that have legal backgrounds, like Keir Starmer himself, and they don't want to. They ask the wrong questions, like smashing the gangs, because they don't want the right answers, which is, it's your country, you sort the problem. You cannot defer to somebody else. It's not their problem, Prime Minister. It's your problem. You need to fix it. When you see like this big summit of all these global leaders down in London, are we going to smash the gangs? We're going to do all this. It's all performative. The power lies with the Prime Minister to fix the problem. That's just my opinion. If you want to come back on that and tell me what your view is.
Yes, I think that you're largely correct there. Now, you spoke about orders in council and how you can get an order in council to make a law happen very quickly. And you're correct. Now, Douglas Carswell had a big article in the Telegraph recently, and I'm just going to quote from it here. He goes, quote, "An incoming government must use the royal prerogative and statutory powers via orders in council to convert the legitimacy of winning a democratic mandate into authority and power over officials in Whitehall to get things done. This means insisting on the King's formal approval of specific orders in council at Privy Council as a condition for forming a government." And so you ask him to approve of these orders in council, which you're doing, I'm saying here, because you've just won the election, you've got the moral authority to do it. And Carswell goes on here, he says, "Orders in council are a type of legislation issued by the Privy Council with the monarch's approval based on recommendations from government ministers. They offer a flexible way to implement changes without needing full parliamentary approval, often drawing authority from existing laws. These orders come into play wherever the royal prerogative extends. This allows them to regulate the civil service, create efficient government mechanisms, manage our borders, and even expedite the deportation of illegal immigrants when needed." I knew I had that page open for a reason. There you go. I've used that perfectly there tonight. But you're right.
Well, not just
Orders in
that.
council
Well, not,
can do
well,
that.
not just that. Well, not just that. In my view, say for example, you're elected on a democratic manifesto. You've been elected to implement your policies. So if your policy is we're going to reduce migration to 50,000 a year, if not negative migration, there's a lot of people down south that say that mass migration is so high that the only answer is negative migration.
Oh yeah, that's
I'm on the
definitely the
fence
case.
on that. I could argue the point either way. If we got to a level of say 40 to 50,000 a year, which is what it was pre 1997, I would say personally that's a very good place to start. But if somebody said to me, Damien, you need to have negative migration, I wouldn't argue against it because there's no strong arguments against it. But my view is about 40 to 50,000 a year, you can integrate quite easily. It's the fact when you're running into millions and millions and millions of people year upon year, and you wonder why the roads have all the potholes in, or you wonder why you can't get a hospital appointments or you can't get school places. It is pretty simple. It's pretty simple. You need to cut the numbers dramatically.
Yeah. And the thing is, every year there's thousands of people leaving the country anyway. Now, I don't have the figures exactly in front of me, but I think in the last year for which we've got figures, it was 1 point something million had come into the country and something like 600,000 had left. Now, imagine that you cut the numbers coming in to 50,000 a year. From 1 point something million, you cut it to 50,000 a year. You're still going to have hundreds of thousands leaving, which will be actually a good thing because most of these hundreds of thousands who are leaving are not actually white, Indigenous, British. They're just recent immigrants leaving in huge numbers. So you cut the numbers coming in very drastically right down. You're going to have hundreds of thousands leaving, and which will be millions over the course of 10 years. So you can get a lot of people just leaving naturally just leaving as they would always have done. The reason that it's growing so much is because the reason the population is growing is because there's far more coming in than are leaving, and that's been the case for years now. So net negative migration is easy to get to. All you have to do is cut the numbers coming in, and you do that by controlling visas, by only giving out a certain number of work visas, a certain number of student visas, a certain number of family visas.
There's even indirect ways you could do it. Okay, say for example you've got somebody coming in and they want a workers visa. Great. If you're doing the job on a workers visa, great, brilliant. It's a 2-year visa. You make it clear that if they want to see your workers visa, after the 2 years, they can't claim benefits if they go out of a job.
Yes.
A lot of people will say, for example, they'll say, right, because they know they can go onto the dole after 2 years, after 3 years, after the 2 years on the initial visa, because they've been here for 5 years, they've got indefinite leave to remain. That should be changed. If you get rid of the pull factor, which is they can claim benefits when they become unemployed, and I'm not making any distinction here between EU migration and non-EU migration here. The principle's the same either way. If you've got somebody who can't afford to pay the way and they've not got savings, then they shouldn't be able to stay. Me and you as British taxpayers shouldn't have to foot that bill. I know that sounds harsh. I know that may sound unkind. But when you've got a £3 trillion debt, you need to think it's the same thing. If I've got £20 to keep me until the end of the month, I'm not going to give it to the neighbour down the street. I'm going to use it to put some money in my gas so I can actually heat my house. You need to be pragmatic. We cannot help the world if we've got a £3 trillion debt.
Yeah. I don't even think that it does sound harsh at all. In fact, I think it's ridiculous. Our generosity for non-citizens is incredible. It's beyond parody, and it might have made some kind of sense a way back, in the 60s or something, when there's very few people, and most of the immigrants were Afro-Caribbeans, and they were only in London, and most of them were employed, or with the transport system and so on.
And they're basically from basically like former empire countries like Jamaica or other places. So it's sort of like a holdover or legacy from empire transitioning into Commonwealth. You could sort of see how that happened.
Yes, I think that quite a few of the politicians at the time as well were seeing that these were like empire people, basically, as it were, and they were still hanging on to the idea of Britain and its empire and the kind of patrician view of looking after the world and all that kind of stuff. And fine, that lasted for a few number of years, but once you got into the 80s and it was clear there's large numbers of people here who can come across, and then in the 90s when it just exploded, then it should have been, right, we have to change the system completely. Anybody coming in on a work visa, nobody gets indefinite leave to remain at all. That should be abolished, because once they get indefinite leave to remain, every benefit is opened up to them. You see,
well, not just that, they get once they've got the indefinite leave to remain, they've got the ability to bring in their relatives.
That as well,
which adds to the bill.
Which adds to the bill as well. So what it should be is, if you're an immigrant here, you've come in on a work visa or whatever kind of visa, you can stay here so long as you remain in employment. And a condition of your visa is to remain in employment. And you get, if you lose your job, okay, we'll give you a month to find a new job. But after a month, if you're still unemployed, I'm afraid you're going home. You've broken the terms of your visa. And that's what it has to be.
Well, if you look at the entry requirements for us as British citizens going to former empire countries like Canada or Australia, it's ridiculously stringent when you think it would be more in line with something that we had when we were members of the EU because of that legacy of empire. But it's not. As British citizens, we do get some benefits, especially if you wanted to emigrate to Canada and you're born before 1982. You've got an easier time than me. Say for myself, I was born in 1983. I've got a harder time emigrating to Canada if I wanted to than my older brother. He was born in 1981 because Canada only severed its formal constitutional ties with the UK in 1982. So that's the cut-off, 1982.
Interesting.
Until 1982, the Privy Council of Britain was the final court of appeal for Canada, and the final court of appeal for Commonwealth nations, Australia and New Zealand, being the Privy Council of Canada, was 1986. There was the
Right.
Statute of Westminster in the 1930s, which gave them essentially home rule as dominions in the British Empire, but they only finally achieved the severance from Britain completely in the 1980s. So you'd think because it was so recent, it would be much easier for Britons like me and you to emigrate. But it's ridiculously stringent. You've got to be able to show that you're going to be in gainful employment. You need to be able to show that you're going to be of benefits to society. You need to have a certain amount worth of savings to say that you're not going to be claiming benefits if you come out of work. We've got nothing like that with our immigration system in Britain. Nothing at all.
Exactly. It's unbelievable, and because it's gone on for so long, people think that this is how it should be. No, we are outliers as far as our ridiculous generosity is concerned, and we need to be reining it in. Absolutely. And nobody's saying that well, basically, it has to be reined in. It has to be reined in, and it has to be stopped because so many people now are going to become eligible. Like the Boris wave in the last 5 years, these people who came in 5 years ago, they are now eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain. The people who came in 4 years ago will be eligible next year to apply for indefinite leave to remain because it's after 5 years legal residence. And when you get indefinite leave to remain, as we say, all benefits, including all housing benefits, social housing is opened up to you, and housing benefits are opened up to you, and so on. So there's millions of people who in the next 5 to 10 years are going to become eligible for the riches of avarice as far as they're concerned. And we are and these are low income people largely.
Yeah, they're not net contributors, they're net drains.
That's the word. Yes. And so those of us who do contribute are going to become responsible for the millions of people who are all going to get British citizenship after a year as well, because you get indefinite leave to remain after 5 years legal residence. Once you've got that, you can, if you want, apply 1 year later to become a British citizen, which, to be frank, doesn't really give you much more than you already have under indefinite leave to remain, but it will give you a passport, and it will give you the right to vote at Westminster elections, and it will give you the right to call yourself British. And these are really the only three things that it does for you.
Moving on from the benefit side of it, because I think straight away, if you done what I mentioned and we had a similar, and you agree with, and we had a system like Canada and Australia and other Commonwealth nations where you've got to prove you can support yourself if you become unemployed, that automatically would reduce the pull factors for so many people to come here.
Hugely.
And then you could do other things like ban halal slaughter in the UK, ban kosher slaughter in the UK. They are, even though I've got no truck with Jewish people, and I really haven't, there's no anti-Semitism here. You've got to have equality, and both kosher slaughter and halal slaughter are not the way that we do it in Britain. And so if you want to slaughter your meat that way, then maybe this country is not for you. That's just my opinion. Now, you'll get a lot of people from ethnic minorities like the Jewish or the Muslims to say, well, you're being discriminatory. Well, no. It's part of assimilation to British society. We believe in humane methods of slaughter for animals if you want to eat meat. If you don't like that, there's plenty of countries that do have halal slaughter and kosher slaughter if you feel that would be preferable. That would reduce a pull factor. And then you can think of other things like, I can't even believe this is a thing that needs to be debated, cousin marriages between individuals. That was a sort of an issue with Parliament. It's like all of these little things add up to a big picture, which is because they want to foster what they call a multicultural society. That doesn't work. You need to be subservient to the dominant culture or the dominant culture, which is British Christianity, and a Christian nation will fade. and that's what we need. That's one of the things that we need to preserve, in my view. Now, I'm not overly sentimental about Christianity. I am a Christian. I am a practicing Christian. However, I'm not what you'd class as a Bible basher, if that makes sense. I don't preach the good book and the good word to all and sundry, because to me it's a personal lifestyle choice. However, the fundamentals of our country are based on the fact that we are a Christian nation, and you need to respect that. So the thing I wanted to say is about religious slaughter. It shouldn't really be a thing in the UK. By the way, that was brought in under a Labour government in the 1930s during the Great Depression. That's how whole, I think it was 1931 or 1934. That's how long that legislation's been embedded into Britain. But because
Right.
when the amount of Jewish people and the amount of Muslim people in the United Kingdom was so low, it was largely not an issue. It's the fact that we've got so many Muslim people coming into the UK now that are starting to become, people are getting self-aware.
Yes. Yes, I think that that particular issue regarding the methods of slaughter and so on, yeah, that was brought in, as you say, at a time when there was very few of them there. But once it had been brought in, then again, it was one of these laws that no thought had been given to what if there's going to be an awful lot of these people in future.
Typical Labour. Typical Labour.
Yeah, no thought given. And this is when you look back at British political history, there's no thought given to just basically everything. And it's don't get me started on on British politicians in the past, but thinking like who would be like a really good politician that we've had, who really. And I know people say, "Oh, Winston Churchill, blah blah blah," but let's remove him from the equation because everybody can
Well,
sometimes
even him
default to
by
him.
Well, even him by his own standards wasn't a complete success, because when he went into power and when he went into Westminster, he wanted to preserve the British Empire. So even under Churchill, you could say, well, he was a half successful prime minister, because yes, you could say that he won World War II, and that's the history as it was written, because we got a big helping hand from America. So you can say that yes, he did win World War II and saved Europe from the mid-century Germans. However, he did preside over the deconstruction of the empire.
Yes, absolutely, and a lot can be traced back to him, like 1951 UN Refugee Convention. He had a big hand in that as well. Not one of his finest moments, I have to say. But beyond that, I mean, who really is there in post-war period? Okay, people will say
Well,
Thatcher, but then again, she's got a checkered history as well on many things when you look into her
well,
deeply,
well,
and
well,
the economy,
she
how it's
wasn't.
tanked
She
under
was.
her as well.
She wasn't particularly strong on Northern Ireland either.
No, no, or she was supported devolution as well for
She did,
Scotland.
but
She
there
didn't
was
give any
always,
thought to it.
but there was complaints. Now I don't know how accurate this is, or this is just the SNP axe to grind, that they rigged the devolution vote in the 70s to make sure it fell. Now I don't know how accurate that is, or that's just the way they like to frame it to have their grievance narrative. But apparently
It's
there was meant to be
yeah.
a vote. But apparently
Sorry.
there was meant. Go on.
Sorry, no, you said there was meant to be a vote for what? Sorry.
Devolution in the 70s, but they sort of rigged it so it didn't go through, or something like that. Whereas basically that's why you didn't get a home rule in the 70s, and they sort of brought it in the 90s instead.
Well, no, there was a vote. There was a 1979 devolution referendum vote. Now, what the nationalists are talk about there is that they had to get 40% of, if they won the seat, if they won the voting, they had to have 40% of the overall electorate, or was it
rather than
60%?
40% of rather than
Oh, I need to look
40%
into
of
it.
the vote. Rather than 40% of the vote, they needed like 40% of the overall population of Scotland, or just the registered voters.
I don't want
Because
to
say,
get
for
this
example,
wrong.
you've got the population, then you've got the registered voters, and then you've got the actual turnout on the day, haven't you? You've got the three separate numbers there.
Here it says in Wikipedia, a majority, 52% of voters supported the proposal for devolution, but an amendment to the Act stipulated that it would be repealed if less than 40% of the total electorate voted in favour. As there was a turnout of 64%, the yes vote represented only 32.9% of the registered electorate, and the Act was subsequently repealed.
That sounds like something similar. Do you know, like in Australia, when they have referendums in Australia, they've got to get it passed the federal level, meaning there needs to be an overall majority in the nation, and each of the individual states in Australia needs to vote for it as well. So, say, for example, when they had their votes in the early 2000s to whether to keep the British monarchy or not, it passed in Australian Capital Territory, which is where all the Liberals are in Australia, but it didn't pass the second test, which is it didn't pass in the other states, and it didn't pass on the federal as a whole, meaning the popular vote either. So it sounds like it was a similar thing in Scotland, where Scotland, there's two barriers. It's not a simple 50 plus 1% majority will carry it over.
Yes, as you say, two barriers, which I think a case can be made for something of such significant constitutional change. The barrier has to be significant in some way. It can't just be, a majority of people on the day thought that this was a good idea back then.
So you think the 50 plus 1 threshold for the 2014 referendum was ridiculous?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It should have been.
Do you think it should have been like a supermajority of 60%, 70%?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would make that case if it was to happen again. Because remember as well, this is politics. So we want to make things as difficult as possible for the people that we're opposing. We're not here to make life easy for them. If they want to break up the country, I'm going to make it as hard as possible for them to do that.
But then the devil's advocate would say, then if you want that for the separation referendum in Scotland, then it needs to be the same for Brexit.
I know.
Now,
but Brexit has happened now, so it's too late.
just for the record, are you a Brexiteer?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, absolutely. So you're
the sort of contradiction, whereas you're pro Brexit but anti separation.
I'm for Britain being, but I suppose you could put it like that. But I'm for Britain being a sovereign nation, which means that it has to be together as a united kingdom, and it mustn't put another parliament over it, which is what we were doing.
And it's a similar thing with a lot of the SNP voters. If they want to be consistent, they would want separation from the EU, and they want separation from the UK as well to be consistent. Like you've got an SNP grandee. I haven't really got a lot of time for him because he's a separatist, Jim Sillars. But he was a staunch Brexiteer, and he's a staunch separatist for Scotland as well. And I actually seen him on Question Time quite a few years ago saying he voted for Brexit reluctantly as a member of the United Kingdom, but he's a Brexiteer. So even though I don't agree with him on the Scottish question, I can respect the fact that he's consistent with it. And he's probably one of the only separatists that I've actually got the time of day for.
Yeah, I think he's entirely consistent, and I think the SNP, to be consistent, should always have supported coming out of the EU as well. And the only reason that they used to support coming out of the EU, but then in the 1970s they had an about face.
That's when Westminster wanted in now. That's when that's literally what they do. They just see what Westminster's doing and run in the opposite direction.
It looks like that half the time. It really does look like that.
Most of the time, so let's be honest with that. I mean, the SNP literally is just it doesn't matter if it's Labour or Tories, they'll just go in the opposite direction. And that's how they think. The way I see it with some of the separatists and some of the way is, it's like they feel they can vote SNP with no consequence because they're protected by the broader UK. Like if the SNP tries to do anything truly insane, like putting biological males into female prisons, Westminster will jump in and say you're not doing that. So it's like they can vote however they want in the devolved assembly as a big FU to the British government with no real consequence because the powers that matter are down in London.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's correct. Yeah, that's what they do. It's a kind of power without responsibility as well, if that's the phrase. Um,
Yeah.
and the last thing the SNP want is good relations between Holyrood and the British government, and they want it to be constantly strained. Now, that's another problem with devolution, of course. The only way around that is if the government in so-called government in Holyrood is the same as the one in Westminster. So for the first few years of devolution, the first 7 years of devolution, the first
There was
two,
Labour in both ways. There was Labour in Edinburgh and there was Labour in London.
yes, and it
And
kind of worked.
but now we're seeing the same in Wales. Where in Wales they've got a Labour devolved administration, and they've got a Labour in Westminster. Now, I don't think the Welsh Assembly is too happy with some of the cuts that Tuateke is bringing in that have
Okay,
affected everyone in the UK. That's just my opinion on the matter. And I think Reform are going to do really well in Wales
okay.
in the 2026 election. And I think they're going to do very well in Scotland as well.
I think they are. I think we're going to see surprises. And I think that a lot of people, a lot of Labour people are going to vote Reform. A lot of disenchanted Tories are going to vote Reform. And you're going to get some SNP people even voting Reform. That's going to happen. And I know that the system up here, the system by which I mean the mainstream media and the MSPs, they're all worried about that because Reform is something completely different. And time will tell how radical Reform is and the extent to which the system is able to capture it. And that might be an easy task for the system, or it might be a difficult task for the system. But it all remains to be seen at this stage how Reform are going
Okay.
to go. But everything seems to be suggesting they're going to do very well. And here in Scotland, consistently polls are showing that they might get between 8 and 14 MSPs out of 129. And in Glasgow, there's talk about them getting 2 MSPs out of, I think it's 8 or 9 on the regional list. So that's like doing extremely well. And I noticed that last year before the general election, I was in town helping a colleague who was doing some vox pops on Buchanan Street, asking who you're going to vote for. And he interviewed a wide range of young and old men and women. And the numbers of people who were saying Reform really was remarkable. And they did well for a new fringe party in Glasgow. You know, they got between 7 and 10% in some areas, if I recall correctly, which is incredible if you know anything about fringe politics to get those sorts of numbers.
You've
And
even had a few defections at council level, councillors defecting over to Reform. I think they're largely Tories, but it speaks to the traction now
mhm,
across the whole of Britain for Reform UK at the moment. Now, I don't want to over egg the pudding on this particular point because there's still a long way to go, both in the whole UK and in Scotland and Wales. But it's going to be very interesting over the next few years. Um, just for timing, we've been on for just over an hour. Are you happy to go for a little bit longer, or do you want to knock this one on the head and we can potentially do another one in a few weeks?
I'm always happy to do another one. If you want to go for another 10 minutes to quarter past the hour, that's fine with me. Yeah.
Right, okay, yeah, that's not a problem. I just wanted to
It's up
check,
to you,
courteous
your
of your
show.
time.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say with the reform issue is there's one thing that I'm a little concerned about, and I don't want to over egg it because they are a new party, and I don't want to say this is a huge issue yet. However, say for example, and there's a comparison with the SNP, and the comparison with the SNP is the SNP had this something in the constitution that you couldn't really, if you was either a member or a politician for the SNP, you couldn't critique the leadership or SNP policy. And they sure, if I'm understanding, I'm remembering it correctly, the enshrined into their party constitution, and that caused people to be ejected from the SNP. With Reform UK, I don't think they've got to that level yet, but there seems to be a bit of a concern that they've not fully democratised it yet. I'm willing to give Reform a lot of leeway currently, simply because they are a brand new party. And they've only basically, as Reform UK, they've only had one proper election test, which was the general election last year. And they've got a long way to go. But they can't afford to do what the SNP did, which is kicking out dissenting voices. They need to be careful about that. Now, whilst they need to protect the brand and they need to make sure that there's no sabotage, purposely people, say for example, at the moment they've got a membership of like over 200,000 people. If tomorrow they got like another 200,000 people, they could all be the lefties in the entire country. And if there's no safeguarding mechanism internally, they could destroy the party. They could basically get rid of Farage. They could get rid of all the right-leaning MPs, and they could install basically a carbon copy of Jeremy Corbyn, and there'd be no way to stop it. So there's an argument to be made there needs to be a safeguard there. However, you need to balance that with making sure it's fully democratized and making sure that it's like if you don't have dissenting voices, you can't get the best outcomes and you can't get the best opinions.
Mm-hmm. So,
what do you think?
I mean,
that's sort of a little bit.
Do you think that Reform have got it right? Have they got the balance right? Because I do agree. I think too much can be made of democracy in a political party, in the sense that you can fully democratize it and end up, as you say, just constantly arguing with everybody. Everybody thinks they've got a right to set the agenda and so on and so forth. And the alternative is a small group of leaders, an elite group who lead the party to victory, and the members can help through activism or money, but get limited say in ideology and strategy and tactics and so on. So there has to be a balance. But you do need to watch. Yeah.
My view is that, as I say, there's a lot of people on the online community, and they're very much throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and they're saying, "Oh, reforms over, reforms done X, Y, and Z. I can't vote for all of them. UKIP is the only way." And to me personally, I'm more in the, I wouldn't say moderate because I am right of centre. Some people in the media, if they see some of my content, will probably class me as very online far right. I don't think I am. I think I'm quite sensible, to be honest. However, there's the perception and appearances matter. So there's the walking a tightrope. The establishment and the media want reform to fail. They're quite happy to have the Tories and Labour pass the baton one way to another in perpetuity. They're quite happy for that to happen. And from London's point of view, the SNP was largely a sideshow. Used to beat the Tories over the head while the Tories were in government to make sure they couldn't do anything truly conservative. And now that the Tories are out of power, you'd find the mainstream media, especially south of the border, I can tell you because I see a lot of the media down south, they don't mention the SNP anymore. So it's literally like they were used as like a threat. So the Tories, don't do anything too radical because of the SNP will make Scotland leave the UK and that'll be your fault. And I'm like, this is balancing act, and it's all designed. It's all designed to make sure that the two-party system stays in place. So I can see both sides. Is what I'm trying to say, and I'd rather wait to see how it pans out, which I'm sure is going to be very interesting throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah, undoubtedly, and reform just seems to be going from strength to strength. And I know some people get caught up in all the social media gossip which can be interesting and fun for them. But at the end of the day, the party machine is rolling on. It seems to be rolling on very effectively, and it seems to be doing extremely well in your area, in your neck of
It
the
is.
woods as well. And if it pulls off a
They've got this
by-election
seat.
victory, I mean, that's just going to be incredible.
They've got this seat. I have it on good authority that they've got this seat.
Really?
That's just, yeah. And yeah, I was right, by the way, on our previous chat at the time, and it was the local elections nationwide. So if this seat does go to reform, they can just brush it off, and everyone's going to be looking at the local council elections because there's thousands of council seats up and running. They're not going to be focused on one MP.
Hmm. Well, true enough, true enough. And there's all of that also, which reform is probably well suited to get an awful big vote from as well. So it's going to be an interesting month, or at least an interesting first week of May, that's for sure.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish this stream now. So I'm just going to thank you again, Force for Good. If you are so inclined, this is to the viewers, give Alistair a look of his channel, give him a watch, and you might be entertained and you might find some of his content informative.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. I'm just going to end the session now. So thanks, Alistair.